Welcome. As we go through the semester, I will usually do a video to accompany each of the chapters. And the reason I do that is to give you a little bit of a surround as to what the chapter is about. So I won't try to redo the chapter, you'll read the chapter, but I will try to cover some of the main points and maybe add some anecdotes that will make the concepts more meaningful for you. So we begin with chapter 1, Effective Managers Understand Organizational Behavior. This is the first of the 5 sections of our course. We'll be looking at five different chunks of information over the semester. And as we, in a couple of minutes, what I'll do is I'll cover each of those 5 with you. But let's begin with what management is. Management is directing the efforts of other people. A good manager successfully directs the efforts of other people. Your book talks about how management began. Actually, management's been going on for a long time. You see the Colosseum in Rome, the Roman viaducts, which brought water throughout the empire, the Roman roads. Going through time, you find things in the 19th century like the Eiffel Tower. You find the organizations of massive armies beginning with our Civil War. All of those required organization and management. But it wasn't really looked at as a science until the beginning of the 20th century. And the famous name that comes up is Frederick Taylor. Some other ones too your book doesn't talk about, Max Weber, but let's begin with Taylor. During the late 19th century, early 20th century in America, people were coming from the farms to work in the factories. A lot of which is going on today in the world, in countries like China, in countries like Vietnam, and throughout parts of Africa. People coming from the farm and for the first time being part of an industrial society. So the concern was about efficiency. We had these hardworking people who were not terribly educated. And what Taylor did is he looked at scientific management. The classic is his work on time and motion. In other words, he would take a look at a function and decide what is it that is being done and what's the best way to do it. It could be something like the person stoking coal into an engine, and Taylor would look at it and say, what's the best coordination between shovel and body to get that done efficiently. We see that carried on to today in operations like McDonald's, where they've got down to a science just how you dip the scoop in and pick up the right number of French fries for an order. So that's a little bit about how we first begin to look at management. Let's talk now about something called organizational behavior, because that's what our course is about. And I'm gonna read this, something I encourage you not to do usually, but once in a while it's better to read it than to ad-lib it. So as we talk about organizational behavior throughout this book, what we'll be doing is drawing on psychology, sociology, political science, and cultural anthropology. And looking at all of those, organizational behavior is the study of the impact that individuals, groups, and organizational structure and processes have on behavior within an organization. That's the end of reading. Okay, that's a big sentence, and we'll explain it further as we go on. We talked a little bit about Frederick Taylor, scientific method. He was focused on really how to do things. He wasn't concerned about the person doing the work, except their function almost as a machine. He wasn't concerned about their psyche, their values, their motivations. The object was just to get the work done. We first get to look at some of those other things regarding the individual in something called the Hawthorne Studies. Hawthorne was a manufacturing plant of the Western Electric Company. The Western Electric Company was part of AT&T, and it was the manufacturing part of the AT&T company. It made telecommunication equipment. A group of psychologists from Yale visited Western Electric's Hawthorne plant outside of Chicago, and they were going to look at how things affected workers' productivity. In advance of their going there, they did a study on lighting. They had a control group. These are basically all women workers. They did a control group where those women working in a particular operation would have no change in their environment. The lights would remain the same. Then they took other groups and they increased the illumination. In other words, they made the factories brighter. And what they found, as they expected, was that productivity went up. They're trying to be scientific though, so they want to look at the other end of the spectrum. What would happen to productivity if illumination went down? So they decreased the illumination. What happened? Productivity again went up. And surprisingly, productivity also went up in the group that had no change in illumination. So everyone's productivity went up. What does that tell us? It tells us that illumination really wasn't a factor. What they found was that workers responded to the fact that they were being taken notice of. People were paying attention to them. And this is a key concept of management and leadership. Pay attention to your workers. That's what they found out in Hawthorne. They did some other things too, though. They found out that bonds within the work group were very effective in terms of productivity. For instance, there was a group that was producing substandard. They were producing 2 components a day, and they should have been producing more. So they looked at that carefully, and they found out that there was an informality within the group, a tightly knit group, that supported those workers who were slower. In other words, those workers who were faster would automatically slow down so that they wouldn't make the other workers look bad. So there was this bonding that even though the other workers could work faster, probably be rewarded more, they didn't do it. There was a retrospective where they got some of the women together after the Hawthorne experiment years later, and they got a little bit of a different twist. What a number of the women said is that, hey, the reason we worked harder was the Depression. And we worked harder because they were watching us, and we wanted to keep our jobs. So the important thing, though, was that Hawthorne was the first look at how conditions affect the workplace. And what they found out is that paying attention is important. Your chapter talks about how businesses have life cycles, and that's going to be important to us when we look at behavior. We would expect a startup company to behave very differently than a company that's been in business 30 years, a mature company. In other words, in that first company, you might have a lot of enthusiasm about we have to work 18 hours a day to get the job done, one for all and all for one. In a mature company, you've got processes in place. People know how to do things. They might work very efficiently, but the enthusiasm's probably not the same. Then your book talks about things that have effects on efficiency, on performance, beginning with quality. And it talks on page 12, it talks about the beginning of the quality movement in America. Um, America used to get by in manufacturing by making lots of product, not necessarily making terrific product, but lots of product. And the idea always was that if something doesn't work, we'll ship the customer a new one. And that all changed when the Japanese rebounded after their loss in World War II. The Japanese were desperate. They wanted to do anything to succeed. And two American prophets, J.M. Duran and W. Edwards Deming, who worked for the AT&T company, were pretty much not accepted with their views, went to Japan. The Japanese were desperate. They'd accept anything, give it a try. And they began putting out quality products. The essence of quality is do it right the first time. Get the job done rightly the first time. And by the 1970s, early 1980s, Japanese automaking had eclipsed American automaking. The Japanese product worked. You could ride out and you wouldn't have to bring it back to have defects fixed. At that point, America embraced total quality. Your book looks also at productivity, efficiency, satisfaction, adaptiveness. And what it concludes is by talking about how and this is kind of obvious, that in the future, what's going to be important to a company, and this is in Exhibit 1.3, is how effectively it uses its human resource, globalism, diversity, speed of change, technology, and what they call the new psychological contract. The old contract being work hard, stay for 30 years, you get a pension and a gold watch. The new social contract, much less generous. Work hard, we'll work with you to keep your skills up to date, that you can move on to work somewhere else someday. I'm oversimplifying, but that's pretty close. Your chapter concludes with a breakdown of where we're going to be going. And take a look at this on page 19. This chapter that we've just reviewed and the next one, chapter 2, take a look at the field of organizational behavior. It sets the stage. We'll be looking then at the breakdown of organizational behavior. Depends on whether you're looking at the individual, which we'll do in part 2. Individual behavior, things like motivation, things like perceptions, employee behavior, stress. So all of that forms part 2. Then we move out to the bigger circle. We're no longer looking only at the individual. In part 3, we'll look at teams, groups and teams, managing conflict, negotiations, power, politics. And then we move on to part 4, the bigger organization, organizational processes. We'll look at decision making, leadership, communications. After we've done all of that, the last 2 chapters form part 5, organizational design, change, and innovation. And this is when we talk about, after we finally understood all the things that affect organizational behavior, we'll take a look at how do you design an organization? How do you change the design? How do you innovate? That's where we'll be going. I'll see you in the next chapter.